I found my power lines cut by the HOA. Hours later, their lights died too. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. Tell me where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, and I truly appreciate every one of your comments. Thank you. Now, let's return to the man at the center of this story. People think power disappears the moment the lights go out. They're wrong. Real power is knowing exactly who had the right to touch the line in the first place. The smell hit me before I even stepped out of my truck that Tuesday evening. Burned insulation. Melted plastic. The kind of sharp chemical odor every electrician recognizes before they even see the damage. I had just finished a 12-hour shift restoring storm damage across 3 counties. My work boots coated in red clay, and my shoulders aching from another day climbing utility poles in 93-degree Texas heat. All I wanted was a hot shower, a cold drink, and an hour in my workshop before calling it a night. Instead, I found silence. My security lights were dark. The small LED fixtures that usually welcomed me home every evening sat lifeless beneath the porch roof. My garage door refused to respond to the remote in my visor. Even the familiar hum of the climate control inside my workshop had disappeared. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my flashlight from behind the driver's seat and followed the gravel path toward the side of my property. Every step crunched beneath my boots with a sound that somehow felt louder than usual. The evening air carried that burnt smell stronger with every yard I walked. Then my flashlight beam landed on fresh dirt. Someone had dug a trench less than 20 feet from my meter pedestal. Clean shovel marks. Fresh tire tracks. Broken orange utility marker flags scattered across the grass. My stomach tightened before I even reached the cables. The main underground service feeding my workshop had been cut clean through. Not torn. Not damaged by weather. Cut. Whoever did it knew exactly where to dig. Whoever did it ignored every utility marker warning buried along that easement. I knelt beside the damaged conduit, brushing loose dirt away with my glove. Copper strands reflected back in the flashlight like broken veins. The PVC insulation was sliced so clean it almost looked surgical. I've been a licensed master electrician for 21 years. My father spent 38 years working utility infrastructure before retiring. He used to tell me something that sounded almost poetic whenever he'd point toward a row of transformers stretching across the Texas sky. Electricity forgives mistakes, he'd say. The law usually doesn't. Back then I thought he was talking about safety. Standing over those severed cables, I realized he'd been talking about something much bigger. I looked toward Willow Creek Estates, the subdivision bordering the north edge of my property. Their decorative entrance fountains sparkled beneath landscape lights. Golf carts rolled quietly through perfectly trimmed streets. Everything looked peaceful. Too peaceful. Especially after the argument I'd had with Patricia Collins only 3 days earlier. Patricia was the kind of HOA president who treated neighborhood rules like constitutional amendments. Perfect hair. Designer sunglasses. A white luxury SUV polished so often it reflected the sunset better than the windows behind it. She'd stood at my fence line holding another violation notice while complaining that my utility trailers and electrical equipment created what she called an industrial atmosphere. I reminded her, politely, that my workshop sat entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. She smiled without moving a single muscle around her eyes. "We'll find another way," she'd said before climbing back into her SUV. At the time, I figured it was another empty threat. Now I wasn't so sure. I walked back toward my house, unlocked the cabinet holding my security recorder, and felt another knot form in my chest. No power meant no active recording after the line had been cut. Whoever came here understood exactly what disconnecting electricity would do. They hadn't just interrupted my evening. They'd erased the cameras that could have shown their faces. That wasn't an accident. That was planning. I stood quietly on my porch as the last orange light faded behind the oak trees, listening to distant laughter drifting from the HOA clubhouse across the field. They sounded like people celebrating another ordinary Tuesday. I checked my watch. 6:42 p.m. I had no idea that before midnight, the brightest neighborhood in the county would be sitting in complete darkness, and not because of anything I did. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens or courtroom speeches. Sometimes it starts with one careless decision, one illegal cut, and a chain reaction that nobody, not even the people who started it, can stop. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line first, because that was what my father always taught me to do whenever property damage crossed the line into something bigger. Stay calm. Document everything. Let the facts speak before emotions ever get the chance. Deputy Ryan Foster arrived about 30 minutes later, his patrol truck kicking up a cloud of pale gravel as the last light disappeared behind the cedar trees. He stepped out carrying a flashlight and a notepad, the smell of fresh coffee following him into the cool evening air. He listened without interrupting while I showed him the damaged conduit, the broken utility markers, and the fresh excavation that had never been there when I left for work that morning. He crouched beside the trench, running his fingers across the clean edge of the severed conduit before letting out a slow breath. "This was not accidental," he said quietly. "Someone came here with a plan." Hearing another professional say the same thing I had already concluded should have made me feel better. Instead, it made the silence around us feel even heavier. He explained that because no one had witnessed the incident and there were no immediate suspects, the investigation would begin as property damage while evidence was collected. He encouraged me to photograph everything before any repairs were made and advised me not to disturb the scene more than necessary. I thanked him, and after his headlights disappeared down the county road, I found myself standing alone beneath a sky full of stars that seemed unusually bright without my yard lights competing against them. I walked into the dark workshop using nothing but a flashlight. Every shelf inside carried years of my life. Cable spools stacked by size. Circuit testers lined up with military precision. Handwritten notebooks from jobs stretching back nearly 2 decades. The scent of machine oil mixed with pine sawdust from an old workbench my father built when I opened the business. He had passed away 4 years earlier, but I still caught myself expecting to hear his boots crossing the concrete floor whenever I unlocked that door. He believed every tool deserved its own place, and every decision deserved a second look before acting. That habit probably saved me more than once. Instead of calling Patricia or driving over to the HOA office, I sat down at my desk and opened the metal filing cabinet beside it. Inside were property surveys, easement agreements, inspection reports, utility permits, and maintenance records organized by year. Some people collect baseball cards. My father collected paperwork. Growing up, I used to joke that he trusted maps more than people. He would only smile and remind me that paper remembers what pride conveniently forgets. I pulled out the original survey from when I bought the property 11 years earlier. Every boundary line was highlighted in yellow. Every underground utility easement had been marked in blue ink using my father's careful handwriting. He had reviewed every page with me before closing day because he insisted that buying land without understanding what lay beneath it was like buying a truck without opening the hood. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Now those faded notes suddenly felt priceless. My phone buzzed across the desk. It was my neighbor, Harold Jensen, who lived on the opposite side of my acreage. Harold was retired from the highway department and rarely called unless something truly mattered. "Ethan," he said without wasting a word, "did your power go out?" I told him what had happened. There was a long pause before he answered. "Well, I saw an excavator over near your fence around lunchtime. White pickup parked beside it. Figured you hired somebody." My grip tightened around the phone. "Did you recognize the truck?" "Not exactly," he replied. "But I remember seeing a magnetic company sign on the door. Could not read the whole name from where I was standing. It was not enough to identify anyone, but it was enough to confirm something important. Someone had been working on my property in broad daylight while I was restoring electrical service for strangers across the county. Whoever authorized that work expected nobody to question it. I thanked Harold and wrote every detail into my notebook, including the approximate time he remembered seeing the equipment. My father had another saying that echoed through my mind while I capped my pen. The smallest detail usually becomes the biggest evidence. I looked once more through the workshop window toward Willow Creek Estates. Porch lights still glowed across the subdivision like tiny stars scattered across perfectly landscaped streets. Children rode bicycles beneath decorative lamp posts while sprinklers whispered across freshly cut lawns. From where they stood, everything probably looked normal. They had no idea that beneath those quiet streets ran a network of electrical infrastructure connected by records, permits, easements, inspections, and decisions made decades before Patricia Collins ever became president of an association that believed it could control everything it could see. The real story, however, was hidden underground, waiting patiently for someone willing to read every page before making the next move. The next morning began with the smell of fresh coffee and damp earth drifting through my kitchen window, but neither one managed to settle my mind. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those clean cuts through the conduit and heard my father repeating that no experienced crew accidentally digs through marked utility lines. Before sunrise, I loaded my camera, measuring tape, inspection mirror, and a folder containing copies of my property survey into my truck. If someone wanted to turn this into a paperwork battle, they had picked the wrong electrician. Every repair job I had ever completed started the same way. Gather evidence first. Touch nothing until every detail had been documented. By 7:30, the morning sun had burned away the last of the fog hanging over my pasture. Dew sparkled across the grass while mockingbirds hopped along the fence line as though nothing unusual had happened. Nature has a strange habit of pretending people have not created problems overnight. I spent nearly an hour photographing every shovel mark from multiple angles. The tread pattern left by the equipment stood out clearly in the soft soil. Whoever operated that machine had entered through the maintenance gate instead of my main driveway. That caught my attention immediately because very few people even knew that service entrance existed. I measured the width of the excavation, noted the distance from the property corner monument, and photographed every damaged utility flag lying in the grass. Each orange marker had been pushed aside instead of naturally displaced by weather. Someone had intentionally ignored them. While reviewing the images on my camera, another memory surfaced from the meeting Patricia Collins held 2 months earlier inside the Willow Creek Clubhouse. She stood beneath a framed photograph of the neighborhood's grand opening, smiling beside a display board labeled Community Beautification Initiative. I had attended only because one of my customers lived inside the subdivision and asked me to answer questions about exterior lighting upgrades. Patricia spent less time discussing flowers than she did complaining about what could be seen from the neighborhood entrance. My equipment trailers, my storage containers, my workshop. She never used my name. Instead, she called my property an unfortunate visual distraction sitting beside an otherwise elegant community. I politely explained that my business had operated there years before the subdivision even existed. Several homeowners nodded in agreement. Patricia responded with that perfectly rehearsed smile that never quite reached her eyes. Communities evolve, she had said. Sometimes older properties need encouragement to keep up. Encouragement. That word stayed with me because it sounded harmless while hiding something much more deliberate underneath. A week later, the first violation letter appeared in my mailbox even though I was not a member of the association. The letter politely requested that I repaint a storage shed entirely outside HOA authority. I ignored it. Another arrived asking me to remove utility trailers parked on private property. Then another suggesting my backup generator created unnecessary visual clutter. Every letter carried Patricia's signature beneath language that sounded official enough to intimidate someone unfamiliar with property law. They never bothered me because I knew exactly where the association's authority ended. Looking back, those letters no longer seemed random. They felt like steps in a much larger plan. Around 9 o'clock, I drove past the entrance to Willow Creek Estates on my way toward the county records office. Fresh mulch surrounded the decorative stone monument, while workers planted seasonal flowers beneath an American flag waving gently above the fountain. Everything looked polished, expensive, and carefully maintained. Residents walked their dogs along sidewalks lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, completely unaware of the investigation quietly unfolding just beyond the tree line. As I slowed near the entrance, I noticed a white pickup parked beside the clubhouse maintenance building. Magnetic company lettering covered the driver's door. Most of the words were hidden behind another vehicle, but one line remained visible long enough for me to read 2 words. Summit Utilities. My pulse quickened. Harold had remembered a magnetic company sign. This truck matched that description almost perfectly. I kept driving without stopping. There was no benefit in confronting anyone based on a partial observation. Facts first, conclusions later. That discipline had kept me safe around live electrical systems for more than 2 decades, and it worked just as well around people. By the time I reached the county records office, one thought had become impossible to ignore. Whoever dug that trench had not acted out of anger alone. They believed they had permission. Whether that permission came from ignorance, misplaced confidence, or someone wearing an HOA title remained to be seen. Either way, every mile I drove brought me closer to the paperwork that would answer a question far more important than who cut my power. I wanted to know who believed they had the legal right to order it in the first place. The county records office always smelled the same, a mixture of old paper, floor polish, and air conditioning that had probably been running since the late 1980s. My father loved this place. He used to joke that every answer worth finding was hiding inside a filing cabinet instead of on the internet. I checked in with the clerk behind the front counter, handed over my parcel number, and asked for every easement, utility permit, and recorded infrastructure agreement connected to my property and the neighboring subdivision. The woman smiled politely and disappeared into the archive room. 20 minutes later, she returned with a stack of documents nearly 4 inches thick. That alone told me my father had been right. Land remembers everything. People rarely do. I settled into a wooden chair beneath fluorescent lights and started reading page by page, resisting the temptation to skip ahead. Survey maps, drainage agreements, utility installation permits, electrical inspection reports. Every signature represented a decision someone had made years before Willow Creek Estates ever sold its first home. Around noon, I reached a document dated almost 16 years earlier. It was an easement agreement between the electric utility company, the original ranch owner, and the subdivision developer. I read the first page twice before moving to the attached engineering drawings. Then I stopped completely. The underground distribution cabinet, supplying emergency switching capability for the north section of Willow Creek Estates, was not located inside the subdivision at all. It sat on a narrow strip of my property, protected by a permanent utility easement that granted maintenance access only to authorized utility personnel. No homeowner association, no private contractor, no landscaping company, no board president. Only the utility company had legal authority to authorize excavation within that protected corridor. My pulse remained steady, but inside my head dozens of loose pieces suddenly began fitting together. Whoever ordered the excavation had either never reviewed these records or assumed nobody else had. I requested certified copies of every relevant document before leaving the building. The clerk stamped each page with practiced efficiency while I carefully organized everything inside a binder. Walking back into the afternoon heat, I noticed my phone vibrating. It was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Walker?" a calm voice asked. "This is Linda Perez with Summit Utilities. I am returning your voicemail about possible damage near one of our underground service corridors." I stepped into the shade beside my truck. The smell of hot asphalt rose from the parking lot while traffic rolled slowly through the square. I explained exactly what I had found without exaggerating a single detail. Linda listened carefully before asking one question that immediately caught my attention. Were official utility locates marked before the excavation? I looked down at the photographs stored on my camera. "Yes," I answered. "Every marker was there before the trench. They were pushed aside afterward." She paused for a moment. "Mr. Walker, if utility locate markers were knowingly ignored inside an active easement, our infrastructure protection team will need to inspect the site immediately." She scheduled an inspection for early the following morning and thanked me for reporting the incident before attempting repairs myself. That last part mattered. She explained that once protected utility infrastructure might have been disturbed, company policy required an independent investigation before anyone restored service. As I drove home, I passed the Willow Creek entrance again. Patricia Collins stood near the fountain directing a landscaping crew while wearing a crisp white blouse and sunglasses despite the gathering clouds overhead. She looked completely relaxed, laughing with a contractor while pointing toward flower beds along the boulevard. For a brief second, our eyes met through my windshield. She offered the same confident smile I had seen during every HOA meeting. The kind of smile worn by someone convinced the situation was already under control. I simply nodded and continued driving without slowing down. There was nothing useful left to say. Words would not change surveys filed at the courthouse. Opinions would not rewrite recorded easements. By the time I reached my driveway, the late afternoon breeze carried the scent of approaching rain across the pasture. My workshop remained silent, the severed conduit still untouched exactly where I had left it. I placed the certified records beside my father's old notebooks on the workbench and looked once more toward the damaged trench. 24 hours earlier, All I knew was that someone had cut my electrical service. Now I understood something much more important. The damaged cable was only the smallest part of the problem. Whoever ordered that excavation had crossed into a section of protected infrastructure governed by rules far beyond the reach of any homeowners association, and by sunrise the people who actually owned that system would be standing exactly where those shovel marks ended. The utility inspection truck rolled into my driveway at exactly 7:15 the next morning, right on schedule. My father respected people who arrived when they said they would, and I found myself thinking he would have liked Linda Perez and the two infrastructure inspectors who stepped out wearing reflective vests with Summit Utilities embroidered across their backs. There was no dramatic entrance, no raised voices, no assumptions. Just clipboards, measuring equipment, digital mapping tablets, and decades of experience walking quietly toward a problem before reaching any conclusions. The morning air still carried the scent of wet grass from the light rain that had passed overnight, while birds filled the silence that my workshop usually occupied with the low hum of electrical equipment. Linda greeted me with a firm handshake before asking me to show them everything exactly as I had found it. I led them to the trench without saying another word. The inspectors immediately noticed details that most people would never have seen. One pointed toward the crushed utility marker flags. Another photographed the exposed conduit from several angles before placing small numbered evidence markers beside the damaged sections. They measured the excavation depth, verified the easement boundaries using satellite mapping tied directly into county records, and compared every coordinate against the original engineering plan stored inside their tablets. I watched quietly while they worked because I knew enough about investigations to understand that silence often reveals more than conversation. After nearly 40 minutes, one of the inspectors looked up from the mapping screen and slowly shook his head. "This corridor is clearly protected," he said. "No excavation authorization was issued here." Linda asked whether I had received any advance notice from the utility company about scheduled work. I answered honestly that I had not. She nodded and made another note before walking farther along the easement. A few yards away, she stopped beside fresh tire impressions pressed deep into the damp soil. Their tread pattern matched the photographs I had taken the previous morning almost perfectly. She photographed those as well before turning back toward me. "Mr. Walker, we are opening a formal infrastructure interference investigation," she said calmly, "until we determine the full extent of possible damage to the distribution system. Company policy requires us to inspect every connected switching point serving this section of the grid." Those words sounded routine, but I understood exactly what they meant. Utility systems are built like carefully balanced chains. Damage in one protected location often requires inspection far beyond the original site to guarantee public safety and system reliability. No responsible utility company would simply reconnect everything without confirming the rest of the network remained secure. By late morning, additional Summit Utilities trucks entered Willow Creek Estates. Bucket trucks parked beside decorative streetlights. Engineers opened pad-mounted cabinets scattered throughout the subdivision. Residents slowed their morning walks to watch crews checking underground switching equipment that had probably gone unnoticed for years. Nobody appeared alarmed yet. Most assumed routine maintenance had arrived. Patricia Collins, however, looked different. I saw her standing near the clubhouse speaking animatedly with one of the foremen while pointing repeatedly toward my property across the field. Even from a distance, I could recognize the confident posture she always carried during HOA meetings, but something about her movements had changed. They were quicker now, less controlled. She glanced toward the inspection vehicles entering and leaving the easement several times before pulling out her phone. I had no interest in guessing what she was saying or who she was calling. Facts were finally beginning to replace assumptions, and that was all I had wanted from the beginning. Around noon, Linda walked back toward me carrying a thick inspection folder. "We have confirmed unauthorized excavation inside an active utility easement," she explained. "The investigation will continue, and additional system verification must be completed before final restoration is approved." She never mentioned Patricia by name. She never blamed the homeowners association. She simply described procedures, documentation requirements, and safety obligations exactly as they existed. That professionalism impressed me more than any promise ever could. Before leaving, she handed me a reference number for the investigation and thanked me once again for preserving the scene instead of attempting immediate repairs. As the last inspection truck drove toward the subdivision entrance, I stood beside my silent workshop listening to the faint rumble of diesel engines echoing through the neighborhood. Somewhere beyond the trees, more utility crews were continuing their inspections, one cabinet at a time, one record at a time, one decision at a time. Whatever happened next would not be driven by anger, revenge, or neighborhood politics. It would be driven by engineering standards, documented easements, and procedures written long before any homeowners association believed it could control infrastructure it did not own. By late afternoon, the investigation had developed a rhythm that reminded me of troubleshooting a complicated electrical fault. Nobody rushed. Nobody guessed. Every answer uncovered another question buried beneath it. Summit Utilities had placed temporary safety barriers around the damaged easement, and bright orange warning flags fluttered in the warm breeze where fresh excavation scars still cut across my property. The sharp smell of disturbed clay mixed with creosote from nearby utility poles while diesel engines idled quietly in the distance. I spent most of the afternoon organizing copies of every document I had collected. Easement agreements, inspection reports, survey maps, photographs, timestamps, and handwritten notes all went into separate folders across my workbench. My father used to tell me that winning an argument feels satisfying for a day, but winning with documentation protects you for years. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang again. Linda Perez asked whether I could meet the senior infrastructure engineer at the easement because they had completed the first stage of their system review. When I walked outside, I found 3 additional utility vehicles parked beside the trench along with a white pickup carrying engineering equipment. The senior engineer introduced himself as Michael Harmon, a quiet man with gray hair and the calm confidence that comes from decades spent solving problems underground where nobody else ever looks. He spread a large engineering map across the hood of his truck and invited me to stand beside him. Colored lines covered the page like arteries beneath skin. Red represented primary distribution circuits. Blue marked communication conduits. Green identified protected switching infrastructure. Then he pointed to a small square drawn directly inside my property boundary. This cabinet, he explained, does much more than feed your workshop. It is also part of the sectionalizing system protecting the northern service loop for Willow Creek Estates. I studied the drawing while everything slowly came into focus. My father had shown me similar maps years ago, but seeing this one connected to the current investigation made every conversation we had ever shared suddenly feel important again. Michael continued explaining that the system had been designed decades earlier so utility crews could isolate sections safely whenever repairs became necessary. Every component depended on accurate records and authorized access. Unauthorized excavation inside that corridor created uncertainty because hidden damage beneath the surface could not be ruled out without additional verification. That is why our procedures are strict, he said. We do not assume underground equipment is safe simply because it still appears to function. His words carried no frustration, only professionalism. Good engineering never relies on hope. While we talked, another inspector walked over carrying several printed photographs. He placed them beside the engineering map. The tread pattern collected from the trench matched impressions found near another access point inside the subdivision. More importantly, someone had located a temporary excavation permit displayed on the dashboard of one contractor vehicle. It authorized decorative landscaping improvements near the entrance fountain. Nothing on the permit mentioned utility work. Nothing authorized excavation across a protected easement. Michael quietly circled several notes with his pen before placing the photographs back into the investigation folder. Nobody celebrated the discovery. Investigations are not about victories. They are about accuracy. Just as the meeting ended, a black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled slowly toward the temporary barriers. Patricia Collins stepped out wearing the same composed expression she always carried during HOA board meetings, although the confidence seemed slightly thinner than before. She approached the barricade but stopped when one of the utility inspectors politely explained that the area had become an active infrastructure investigation and could not be entered without authorization. I remained where I was beside the engineering truck. She glanced toward me for only a second before directing her attention back to the inspectors. "This maintenance is affecting our community schedule," she said in an even voice. How much longer will this take? Michael answered with remarkable courtesy. As long as necessary to verify system integrity and complete the investigation. There was nothing dramatic about the exchange. No raised voices. No accusations. Just one simple sentence supported by company policy. Patricia thanked him politely, returned to her vehicle, and drove away without another word. I watched the dust settle behind her tires while an unexpected sense of calm settled over me as well. For the first time since discovering the damaged conduit, I no longer felt like I was standing alone against an organization determined to push me aside. The situation had grown larger than neighborhood politics. It now belonged to engineers, documented easements, infrastructure standards, and procedures that treated every property owner by the same set of rules. As the sun dipped lower across the Texas sky, Michael rolled up the engineering map and offered one final observation before leaving. "Mr. Walker," he said, "sometimes the most important part of an electrical system is the piece nobody notices until someone tampers with it." I looked across the quiet fields separating my workshop from Willow Creek Estates and realized he could just as easily have been talking about the law. The following morning arrived unusually quiet. The steady stream of utility trucks that had filled the area the day before had been replaced by only a handful of specialized inspection vehicles, each parked with deliberate precision around the protected easement. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted across the pasture, while a light breeze rattled the orange warning flags that still marked the damaged corridor. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic, yet I could feel the weight of something much larger taking shape beneath the surface. Investigations often move that way. The loudest moment happens first. The most important work happens afterward, when every document, every measurement, and every decision begins connecting to the next. I unlocked my workshop even though there was still no permanent electrical service. Sunlight poured through the open bay door, illuminating shelves of tools that had been sitting untouched for days. Instead of picking up a wrench, I opened my father's old ledger once again. Between inspection notes and maintenance records, I found a handwritten checklist he had created years earlier whenever utility companies performed major infrastructure work. Photograph everything before repairs. Record every conversation. Never assume memories will remain accurate. Let official records tell the story. Reading those words steadied me more than any legal advice could have. Around 9 o'clock, Linda Perez returned with another member of the utility investigation team, carrying several sealed folders. She explained that the engineering review had expanded after additional inspections inside Willow Creek Estates revealed inconsistencies between contractor activity and the permits submitted for the neighborhood improvement project. Nobody accused anyone of intentional wrongdoing. Instead, they focused on one simple question: who authorized excavation inside a protected utility easement without notifying the utility company? That answer required paperwork, not speculation. Linda asked whether I had retained every violation letter previously sent by the Homeowners Association. Fortunately, I had. I retrieved a file from my office cabinet containing every notice Patricia Collins had mailed during the previous several months. The letters seemed harmless when viewed individually. A request to relocate equipment. A reminder about appearance. A recommendation to improve visual consistency along the neighborhood entrance. But when Linda arranged them chronologically across my workbench, a pattern emerged. Each letter gradually shifted attention toward the exact section of my property where the protected utility corridor crossed the fence line. She studied them silently before placing copies into the investigation file. "Sometimes context matters as much as evidence," she said quietly. Shortly after noon, another development arrived unexpectedly. Deputy Ryan Foster stopped by with a polite update regarding the original property damage report. He explained that Summit Utilities had formally notified the county that their infrastructure investigation would likely determine many of the technical facts surrounding the excavation. His role would remain focused on documenting property damage while cooperating with the utility company's findings. I appreciated the transparency. Every agency stayed within its own responsibility instead of competing for attention. That professionalism reminded me of electrical systems themselves. Every component performs a specific job, and reliability depends on each part respecting its limits. While we talked, 2 engineering supervisors walked toward the damaged trench carrying updated site drawings. They pointed out several underground reference markers that had been uncovered during the inspection. One marker, nearly hidden beneath loose soil, contained an identification plate installed more than 15 years earlier. Its serial number matched the engineering records exactly. That small aluminum tag quietly confirmed what every document had already suggested. The location had never been abandoned, relocated, or transferred. It remained active utility infrastructure protected under the original easement. As the afternoon sun settled high above the property, utility crews began preparing their final assessment. Temporary testing equipment was connected to multiple access points throughout the subdivision while technicians compared electrical readings across different sections of the distribution loop. I watched from a respectful distance, fascinated by how carefully every step followed written procedure. Nobody hurried because reliable systems are built through patience, not speed. Across the field, residents gathered near the clubhouse, watching the unusual level of utility activity with growing curiosity. Patricia Collins appeared several times, speaking with board members and contractors before disappearing back inside the building. Even from where I stood, I noticed something missing. The confident smile that had accompanied every previous encounter had been replaced by quiet uncertainty. She no longer looked like someone directing events. She looked like someone waiting for answers from people she could not instruct. As the day drew toward evening, Linda closed her folder and offered a brief update before leaving. The investigation was nearly complete. Engineering findings had been verified. Administrative reviews were underway. Any operational decisions affecting the electrical system would be made strictly according to established safety standards and utility regulations. I thanked her, closed the workshop door behind me, and watched the last inspection truck disappear beyond the oak trees. The waiting was almost over. I had never asked anyone to punish my neighbors. I had only asked that the truth be measured with the same precision used to measure electricity. By then, I had complete confidence that it would be. The call came just after 6:30 the next evening while I was replacing batteries inside one of my temporary work lights. The sky outside had turned a deep shade of orange, and the scent of cedar carried across the pasture as another warm Texas day slowly faded into evening. My phone displayed Linda Perez's number. Her voice remained calm, exactly as it had been since the first inspection. She explained that the engineering review, administrative verification, and infrastructure assessment had all been completed. The findings confirmed unauthorized excavation within an active utility easement and identified multiple locations requiring immediate safety verification before the distribution loop could continue operating under normal conditions. Because the integrity of the interconnected system could no longer be guaranteed until every affected component had been inspected, Summit Utilities had authorized a temporary protective shutdown for the northern service loop while repairs and testing were completed. It was not a punishment. It was not a legal judgment. It was standard operating procedure whenever protected infrastructure had potentially been compromised. I thanked her for the update and wished the crew a safe evening. Less than an hour later, the first utility trucks returned to Willow Creek Estates. Their amber safety lights flashed quietly beneath the darkening sky, while technicians positioned traffic cones around several pad-mounted cabinets throughout the neighborhood. There were no sirens, no dramatic announcements, and no confusion among the crews. Every person moved with the quiet confidence that comes from following a written procedure practiced hundreds of times before. I stood near the fence separating my property from the subdivision, far enough away to avoid interfering, but close enough to observe the careful choreography unfolding across the neighborhood. Residents slowly gathered on sidewalks, some carrying lawn chairs, others holding cups of coffee as they watched the unusual level of activity. Children pointed toward the utility trucks while parents quietly speculated about maintenance work. Even then, nobody appeared alarmed. At precisely 7:58, one technician spoke briefly into a handheld radio. Another acknowledged from the switching cabinet farther down the street. A third confirmed the final safety checklist. Then, almost imperceptibly, the neighborhood changed. Decorative entrance lights faded. Landscape lighting around the fountain disappeared. Porch lights blinked once before going dark. The clubhouse windows lost their warm glow. Air conditioning units that had hummed softly all evening fell silent one after another until an unexpected stillness settled across Willow Creek Estates. I looked back toward my own workshop. It was still dark as well, because permanent repairs to my damaged service had not yet been completed. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, everyone waited under the same evening sky. The difference was that my outage had started with someone digging where they should not have. Theirs began because engineers refused to energize a system until they knew it was safe. Across the entrance road, Patricia Collins stepped out of the clubhouse and walked toward one of the utility supervisors. Even from the distance, I could see she was speaking calmly, gesturing occasionally toward the dark subdivision behind her. The supervisor listened respectfully before opening a folder and pointing towards several engineering diagrams clipped inside. There was no argument that I could hear. No dramatic confrontation. Only a professional explanation supported by maps, inspection reports, easement records, and company procedures. Patricia accepted the documents, thanked him politely, and stood quietly beside the sidewalk as additional. Technicians continued their work. Around 8:30, Michael Harmon approached the fence near my property after finishing another inspection. He smiled faintly before extending his hand. "Everything is moving exactly as expected," he said. "The shutdown will remain in place only as long as necessary to complete final verification and replace the damaged infrastructure." I asked whether repairs to my service could begin as well. He nodded. "Your conduit replacement is scheduled first thing tomorrow morning. Once the damaged section has been rebuilt, tested, and inspected, we can begin restoring the entire loop in sequence." Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of relief. I had spent days documenting evidence, preserving records, and trusting procedures instead of emotions. Now the same system that investigated the damage was preparing to restore what had been lost. As darkness settled completely across the field, the stars appeared brighter than I had seen them in years, unobstructed by hundreds of neighborhood lights. Standing there, I remembered something my father once told me while we watched utility crews repair storm damage after a summer tornado. "Good engineers never rush electricity," he said. "They earn it back one safe connection at a time." Looking across the quiet subdivision, I realized that justice often works the very same way. It does not arrive through anger or revenge. It arrives through patience, evidence, and people willing to do every step correctly, even when nobody is watching. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the crisp scent of fresh earth where the damaged conduit had been carefully uncovered for replacement. Sunrise reflected off the new utility equipment lined neatly beside the trench, while Summit Utilities crews moved with the same steady professionalism I had watched throughout the investigation. Every connection was rebuilt according to engineering specifications. Every splice was inspected twice. Every measurement was verified before a single section was covered with soil again. I stood beside my workshop holding a cup of coffee, listening to the familiar sounds that had shaped my entire career. Hydraulic tools, test meters, radios exchanging short, precise updates. There is a certain comfort in watching people who genuinely know what they are doing. Shortly before noon, Michael Harmon walked over carrying the final inspection paperwork. He smiled as he handed me a signed completion report confirming that my electrical service had been restored, the damaged conduit replaced, and every affected section of the distribution loop successfully tested under load. "Everything checks out," he said. "Your service is back online, and the northern loop has passed every verification." I thanked him, reached inside the workshop, and flipped the main breaker. A soft click echoed through the building. One by one, the overhead lights came alive. The familiar hum of compressors returned. Battery chargers blinked green. My climate control system quietly started circulating cool air once again. It felt less like electricity returning and more like normal life finding its way home. Later that afternoon, I received copies of the official investigation summary. The report concluded that unauthorized excavation had occurred within the protected utility easement without proper authorization or coordination with the utility company. As a result, corrective actions, infrastructure repair costs, and any related administrative matters would proceed through the established legal and regulatory processes. Those decisions no longer belong to me. They belong to the organizations responsible for maintaining public infrastructure and enforcing the agreements recorded years before I ever bought the property. Several days passed before I saw Patricia Collins again. She approached my fence on a quiet Saturday morning while I was organizing extension cords inside the workshop. She was not carrying another violation notice. She was not surrounded by board members or contractors. She simply stood near the gate for a moment before asking whether we could speak. I walked over and listened. She admitted that the neighborhood improvement project had moved forward far too quickly and that assumptions had been made about property boundaries and maintenance authority without verifying the utility records first. She did not ask me to ignore what had happened. She did not ask me to intervene in the investigation. She simply acknowledged that the situation had become much larger than anyone on the Homeowners Association board expected. I appreciated the honesty. I told her exactly what I believed from the beginning. None of this would have happened if someone had taken one afternoon to review the recorded easements before approving excavation. Paperwork may not be exciting, but it prevents expensive mistakes. She nodded quietly, thanked me for the conversation, and walked back toward the subdivision. That was the last time we spoke. Over the following weeks, the temporary barriers disappeared. Fresh grass gradually covered the repaired trench until it blended naturally into the surrounding pasture. New utility markers stood exactly where the old ones had once been, brighter and easier to see than before. My workshop returned to its normal routine, filled once again with customers, repair projects, and the comforting rhythm of honest work. Harold stopped by one afternoon carrying 2 cold bottles of lemonade. We sat beneath the shade of the old oak tree overlooking the property while watching another utility crew perform routine maintenance farther down the county road. He laughed softly before saying, "Funny how the biggest problems always start with somebody thinking the rules apply to everyone except them." I smiled because he was right. My father understood that long before either of us did. Before he retired, he wrote one sentence inside the cover of every field notebook he ever carried. After cleaning out his office years ago, I found those same words repeated dozens of times in his careful handwriting. They now sit framed above my workbench where I can read them every morning before starting another day. Respect the property. Respect the records. Respect the people. The rest usually takes care of itself. Looking back, I never defeated anyone. I never needed revenge. I simply trusted documented facts, experienced professionals, and a legal process designed to protect everyone equally. Electricity eventually returned to every house in Willow Creek Estates. Mine came back first only because the damaged line had been repaired where the problem actually began. That is the lesson I carried forward from the entire experience. Real power has very little to do with switches, transformers, or electrical lines. Real power comes from patience, preparation, and knowing that the truth does not have to shout when the evidence is already speaking for it.